Okay guys, welcome to lecture 2 on the topic of envy. As always, we are going to now explore some of these theoretical materials that we've already discussed in the concrete realm of the medieval West. We're going to focus very specifically this time on the 12th and 13th centuries, and we're going to focus very specifically on one issue, which is hatred and marginalization. It's an important topic for us to approach. As we discussed right at the outset of the course, we are studying the Christian Middle Ages, right? That is to say, we are focusing on the predominantly west of Europe, where we're talking about a vast majority Christian culture, where most people are involved in the same church community. Most people go to church on Sundays. They celebrate the same saints' days. They are part of a Catholic Christendom, which has developed more or less by the 1100s to be something quite self-conscious. But as I said straight off, this is not the whole picture of Europe. And as I said, I think in the first lecture, but as we saw with the Crusades, there are many, many people who do not consider themselves Christian, living alongside Christians, and even more than that, people who do not agree with the way that an establishment Christianity looks and believe that there could be other ways of doing Christianity. These people who are often labelled heretics. And I'm going to focus specifically, we're going to talk about one group in particular, which is Judaism and Jewish people in medieval Europe. And the reason we're going to focus is, as I think I alluded in the first lecture, on the one hand, Jewish people are assigned the role of envy in a Christian myth of the relations between the two races. This idea that the Jews were envious of Christ and that Jewish people are envious of Christians in the precise destructive way that we discussed in the first lecture. That is, they want to destroy Christianity. This is one of the myths. So on the one hand, Jewish people in Europe are often given, not always, but often we see this dynamic. They are envious of Christianity. And this is something we need to explore. But on the other hand, I think it's fair to say there's an awful lot of envy that goes with this persecution. In fact, you could argue that all of the persecution of Jewish communities in medieval Christianity can be described under the rubric of envy, in the specific terms of wanting to destroy the other. Or, maybe not, let's not talk about it in terms of explaining persecution, but we might just say that envy is a way into understanding something of the psychology of how we get persecution. And we do get persecution, I'm afraid. I'm afraid there is a lot of killing in this lecture. I suppose, why is it important? It's important for lots of reasons. It's important, I suppose, for the history of medieval Europe, that you understand just how much of a role persecution and violence played in the making of Christendom. This is not a story of a harmonious community, which is, of course, what Seneca imagined for human nature. You know, humans are meant to get on with one another. Dante, in his Commedia, imagines, you know, the perfect Christian community is one of peace and tolerance and respect and love. But, you know, it's important to tell you the story of the murder. It's important to tell you the story of persecution. Just to round out your image, the Christian Middle Ages were not a period of tolerance and happiness that then gave way to a violent and cruel modernity. We're going to have to look at the cruelty. That also, by the way, helps us understand the dynamics. How did medieval Christianity operate? How did it become so successful? Also through marginalization and a production of an other against which it could articulate its own community. So we need to discuss that. It's not all doom and gloom. There are positive, I think, in a normative sense, we would call positive race relations in this period. We need to try and puncture through and see some of those. But there is so much murder and violence that we have to look at that too. Secondly, or finally, it's important for a history of race and racism. If we are interested in racial relations today in the 21st century, and if we accept that racism or race discourse is essentially about the production and management of articulations of difference, what makes one group different from another, that this is something produced. It's not obvious. Sometimes you can have like epidermal race, that somebody has a different skin color. It seems obvious. But this doesn't mean it's the essential element in producing difference from one to the other. Often language can be a stronger way of producing difference. Religion, a stronger way of producing difference. If you think about Islam treated as racial difference in like the terrorism of the early 21st century. But here, with Judaism, we see another dimension to the history of racism, that, if we want to call it that, which is the production of difference, which is often slight, which is then exaggerated. And it's so important because I think it's one of the most formative examples of racial tension and violence in Western history. It's pretty violent. And in terms of anti-Semitism alone, it's like the first sort of instances of these kinds of anti-Semitic myths in Western history in a substantial way. So we need to explore them. Okay, so in this lecture then we will do three things. We have, first, we're going to explore the Blood Libel. The origins of this myth of, well, what is a Blood Libel? You'll have to see. It involves a myth and an accusation made against Jewish people. We will segue into the question of sexual envy. This is to say that relations between races, or between Christians and Jews, or between Christians and Muslims, involve some amount of sexual anxiety on the one hand, sexual jealousy on another, which we could approach under the rubric of envy, as we discussed in our first lecture today. And finally, this larger question of seeing race in medieval Europe, if we can move beyond the, I don't want to call it the Jewish problem, the problem that Christians have with Jews, if we move beyond that, then we move outwards to other races, other ways of seeing race. Is there such a thing as racism in the Middle Ages? Is it useful for us today, in the year 2020, to examine this period under terms of racism? And if we're doing so, are we applying and imposing a modern paradigm, or are we inflecting a modern paradigm through this quest, which is what I hope we could do? Okay, let's begin with the Blood Libel. The Blood Libel. This is one of those things where we can really trace an origin. I believe that in 1144 we see the first example of this thing called the Blood Libel. What is it? Well, look, Christian persecution of Jews, I think I alluded to this in our Crusades lecture. I think if you're going to sort of put a marker down and say this is where it begins, then you might well choose the year 1096, and you might well go to the Rhineland. These are the Rhineland massacres, or pogroms, of 1096. I mentioned these before. I'll say it now in more detail, in more unpleasant detail. This is, you remember, Pope Urban II stood at the Council of Clermont and called for a crusade against, the non-believer, specifically against Islamic people in the Holy Land, right? To win back Jerusalem for Christianity. Of course, articulating there a strong difference. Christianity versus an other, which is Islam. You remember, and all the crowd, according to a one or two count, shout, Deus vult, God wills it. And there is this popular enthusiasm. And you remember with that first crusade as well, that the popular enthusiasm was split. That there was, as well as being an aristocratic crusade, which had 4 different sections to it, led by 4 or more different commanders, there was also the People's Crusade, if you remember, which was led by Peter the Hermit, which of course was doomed. That was a doomed mission, wasn't it? The entire popular army ended up being sold into slavery or being killed, and the bones were discovered. Well, let's not go over it again. After that had happened, the People's Crusade, and working off some of that enthusiasm, there are small splinter groups of popular would-be crusaders who unite under the idea of, and I think I mentioned this before, we're going all the way to Jerusalem to fight the unfaithful, to fight the non-Christian. And the logic then became, well, with all of this weaponry and all of this enthusiasm and this sense of purpose, wouldn't our force be used better, beginning with fighting the enemy within? And this is how it begins. And this is the production, if you like, that moment in which someone says the enemy within is where it begins. this sense that Judaism is an enemy against Christianity at home. Now, it hadn't been all roses before this, but we don't before this have this mass violence. It's not on record that there is Christian-Jewish violence. It's not on record. I'm sure local scuffles, I don't know. The fact of the matter is that this is a pretty big break where there's no real evidence of violence. It's not like gangs of people are beating up Jewish people. And then suddenly we have mass violence. And it's worse than mass. It's really, really serious. These are massacres. The accounts we have, I think Count Emic is the villain, if you want to Google all of this. The massacres that are described are extremely harrowing to read about. But we are talking about men, women, and children being killed. And we're also talking about forced conversion, instances where entire families are rounded up and said, you know, you either convert to Christianity or we burn your house down. It's things like that. It is a serious piece of antagonism. And I don't want to put a figure on it. But we are talking about tens of thousands of Jewish people who lose their lives in these pogroms. This is a 16th century woodcut reproduction, an image of one of these massacres. I would note that this is stoicism in the face of being burnt alive, which, you know, and I'm being quite serious here, that we can see some kind of empathy in this image, even though it's a horrifying image. But that's not what we're going to discuss now. So this is one precedent to bear in mind. This is this is the beginning of persecution, but it is not the beginning of the blood libel. This is a kind of hostility and a moment of unconscionable violence. But it is not the same thing as what we have soon, which is the production of a myth, a much more complex, or in other terms, simple, but complex myth, which associates Jewish people with conspiracy. And this is the blood libel. And let's go to the first case, which is, unfortunately, in Norwich. I say unfortunately because this is the city that my mother has just moved to. But it's unfortunate that this is the reason we're going to mention Norwich in this entire lecture series. It's a beautiful city, guys. Wonderful cathedral. More churches than any other city in England. But still, this story. The year's 1144. The facts are quite simple at the outset. There's a forest on the edge of the town, and in this forest, I think it's just after Easter, they find the body of a small child. So a small child, a little boy, whose name is William, and he has been killed. And this is all we know for sure. This is the end of the facts. Everything after this becomes conspiracy, conjecture, fantasy, fetish, envy, whatever you want to call it. The facts are, in terms of these myths, the next stage of development is there is an accusation made. And the accusation is, and it's from certain members of the town of or the city of Norwich, the accusation is that this little boy, his death is not an accident, that he was killed, and that he was killed deliberately. Here is an image of what they imagine happened. The idea, and of course this grows, and it's difficult to know. The way we know what happens next is because one man, a monk called Thomas of Monmouth, decided to come all the way from Monmouth to solve the murder, right? Like a detective. He went all the way, not on the train, obviously. I don't know how he got there. He went to solve this murder, and he wrote this enormous volume, or series of volumes, about the murder, trying to solve it. And he interviewed all sorts of people, and he came to the conclusion that this was the consensus. The consensus was that the Jewish community of Norwich, in their jealousy, in their envy of Christians, had, at Easter time, or Passover, decided to make their usual annual sacrifice of a Christian child. So, a couple of things there. The idea was that this was a regular conspiracy that had already been happening and that this was the latest version of. The idea was, and the timing is significant. It's associated with Passover. So this is on the one hand, and Easter too. So on the one hand, remember, Easter is the time that Christ himself is killed. So it's like some sort of ritual reenactment of Christ's killing. And you see in this image, of course, the resonance with Christ is there. You remember that apocryphally, the Jews are blamed with the crucifixion of Christ. This doesn't really make sense because, of course, it was a Roman act of punishment, blah, blah, blah. But, there's this common myth, it's the Jews who laughed at Christ on the cross and who brought about the Christ killers in this myth. So the idea is, according to rumour, according to what Thomas of Monmouth discovers in Norwich, the idea is that this is a ritual killing and it's a conspiracy. Let's hear from the text itself, okay? This is what they imagine happened. And you can see some of the elements. Then the boy, like an innocent lamb, was led to the slaughter. He was treated kindly by the Jews at first, and ignorant of what was being prepared for him, he was kept till the morrow. You see, it's important here, it seems, in this myth, that there's this deception, obviously, that it's not some frenzied rage, that Jewish people leapt on a boy and killed him as part of a ritual, that there also seems important that there's this conspiracy aspect, this secrecy. Notice the lamb as well, of course, which is, of course, an image of Christ. Taking a short piece of rope of about the thickness of one's little finger and tying 3 knots in it at certain distances marked out, they bowed round the innocent head with it from the forehead to the back. Notice here the detail, the level of detail, which is unusual, seems to be important. I don't know whether that's to convince the reader that this is definitely true, because we know exactly how far apart the notches were on the rope. I don't know. But not even yet could the cruelty of the torturers be satisfied without adding even more severe pains. Having shaved his head, they stabbed it with countless thorn points and made the blood come horribly from the wounds they made. It's gratuitous detail, isn't it? I think, again, notice the level of effort, that this is seen as something meticulously planned, seen as something, but beyond that, also something enjoyed. And I think that if you think about the first lecture, and we think about Lacan saying envy is when you hate the jouissance, the excess pleasure of the other. I think here we see that excess. It's not just killing, it has to be an excess, an excessively enjoyable killing, which is what's being imagined. And finally, and I'm sorry that this is very graphic, conspiring therefore to accomplish the crime of this great and detestable malice, they next laid their blood-stained hands upon the innocent victim, and having lifted him from the ground and fastened him upon the cross, they vied with one another in their efforts to make an end of him. This is the origin of the blood libel myth. And I'm afraid that this does not go away. It does not go away, really, in Western history. Has it gone away? Well, I hope so, but certainly in the 20th century, and certainly with obvious parallels with the events in Europe in the 20th century, you would argue that these myths sustain themselves. It's a long story. You see the obvious Christ parallels. So you see the conflation, Jewish community killing today, Jewish community accused of killing Christ, this important parallel, which is being drawn out at least by the writer Thomas of Monmouth. But again, to emphasize, it's that enjoyment element. The contrast between innocent victim, unseeing, and dastardly and cunning, envious killers. So this blood libel then, and it's interesting to go back to the map because they multiply. They begin in 1144. This next slide, this is not, unfortunately, I forgot to add this for the camera, but it'll just be you in the room who see this next slide. This is just an example of how does this sort of imagination about what happened about Judaism and Christian relations, how does it spread? So we have a blood libel, one book. Is everyone reading the book? I don't know. I'm sure people are talking about these sorts of things, but I don't know how. But it seems to endure. We could look at culture. This is an object which absolutely fascinates me. I think it is the most hideous piece of anti-Semitic art in English history, which is why I'm interested in it, because it's so unusual. It's so early. It is a beautiful piece of walrus ivory, but that might be all you can say for it. The Cloisters Cross, from around about just after William of Norwich, fixates on the question of Jewish people killing Christ, and moreover, the apparent enjoyment of the act of killing Christ, to the extent that written on the side of the cross we have this little rhyme which says, Ham laughed at his father when he saw him naked. This is from the Old Testament, that Ham saw Noah naked and laughed. And that's why Ham was given to inherit the continent of Africa, which was seen as the curse of Ham. He laughed at his dad, so he gets the worst part of the world in this racist Christian imaginary. That's another story. But the other side of the rhyme is the Jews laughed at the punishment of the dying God. So it's important for this cross, and there are many other anti-Semitic elements in it, there's many other fixations on Judaism and other things. But for this cross, it's important not just that the Jews killed Christ, but they laughed while doing it, that there was some enjoyment in it. And this was the problem. Okay, so art like that circulates. Gloucester in 1168, we have another story, this little boy Harold of Gloucester, and this one is worked up into a poem, a short poem, and it's another story of the Blood Libel in exactly the same sort of scenario. Again, I think it's associated with Easter, and again, you can see from this rather later depiction, just about you can see that it involves some level of torture, gratuitous punishment, gratuitous. I know all killing is gratuitous, of course it is, but I mean more than just killing, also this enjoyment in killing of a small boy. Bury St Edmunds in 1181, it happens again. Robert of Bury, here we go, the story happens again. And just a quote from that story. The saintly boy Robert was murdered and buried in our church. Many signs and wonders were performed among the people, as I've recorded elsewhere. I believe this is a small boy discovered in a well, which again the Jewish community is blamed. And again, the accusations, oh, it's a blood libel, it's a ritual sacrifice. They're doing it because it's Easter, and they're envious of our Easter celebrations. Stories at this point begin to circulate of Jewish people destroying the Eucharist wafer. You know, in the time of communion, Christians eat the wafer, which is supposed to be the body of Christ. Well, now we start to get stories and plays of Jewish people deliberately stealing this wafer and attacking it, defiling it, throwing it in the mud, spitting on it. This ludicrous kind of myth that there's this thing that they're, what other word would you use? Envious of, jealous of. When at Bristol in 1183, I believe there's a terrible story in Bristol of a Jewish man who a dentist tortured by ripping all his teeth out. I can't remember the exact nature of the story. London in 1189. This is actually the coronation of Richard the Lionheart. On the coronation of the Richard the Lionheart, outside of the church, this group of Jewish people were attacked, and a few of them, I think, were killed in this kind of, maybe more than a few. I forget the exact details, but it's interesting that in the moment of celebration, attacking a minority community. Moving on. I'm sorry, guys. This is like a real map of it. For me, it's awful that this is all you're going to think about when you see the map of England for the next few hours. You think, oh no, it's just this series of blemishes of violence. York in 1190 is the worst of them all. This is more than just the blood libel. I think what we're starting to see now is we're starting to see communal violence normalized and regularized, which is to say, more than just making up a conspiracy, also just turning on and attacking the Jewish community for no real reason. 1190 involves, and if you ever, I used to go past York. If you're ever passing that city, who knows? Life is long. There's this castle which you pass, and it's impossible to see it once you know what happened in it in the same way. But it's this castle up on a hill, all the more haunting in the knowledge that it's a place that was where the Jewish community were herded into and then burnt alive. And this is unimaginable violence, isn't it? It's unimaginable violence. It's based on what? Based on what? And I think that's the essence of what I'm trying to get at. What is the kind of production of a difference between one group and another that can lead to this level of violence, lead to this level of hatred? Because, of course, it's hatred we're talking about, which I think envy is as good a word as any to access hatred. What does hatred really mean? You remember with Aristotle, anger, irritation, or not Aristotle, Augustine, anger and irritation are one thing, but once they harden, that's when we get hatred. Hatred is something much more, something that sticks with you. And we have to try and think about how that difference is produced, and we'll do that as the lecture goes on. Leicester in 1231, Lincoln in 1255. This is another story which is, and it shows that nothing changes. It's 110 years after William of Norwich, and it's just the same story yet again. A little boy in a well, I think he's 8 or 9 years old. They call him Little Saint Hugh. He was made into a folk saint because, again, he's seen as a victim of Jewish conspiracy, Jewish violence. And following this, this is where you get the mix of the blood libel with popular violence. And I'm afraid to say it's something like, 100 Jews arrested and 19 hanged in this, arrested. I should say with William of Norwich, nobody was accused or convicted of any murder. The bishop and the king, I believe, were both involved and came to the conclusion there's no evidence. There's no evidence that Jewish people killed this boy. It's not like we're dealing with a society where there's no justice. There is justice, right? In fact, Jewish people were often protected by the monarch, often called the king's Jews, in the sense that often the king had a personal role in preventing violence. The bishops too. Bishops often protected Jewish communities against mob violence. You have a question. I think there's a microphone just here. Pass that on. Yes, please, your question.
Why it's only boys?
Why is it only boys?
Yeah, I'm interested.
That's a really good question, isn't it? Yes. Yeah, I can't answer that question. I think, do you know, I've never actually seen that question asked either in the literature, so it's a good one. We can make all kinds of suggestions. We can make the suggestion that the parallel with Christ is stronger when we're dealing with a situation with a boy. I really can't tell you. I think it's a really interesting one. But it does seem to always be the same structure. Maybe it's just the blood libel becomes a hardened myth, and then if you change any of the elements, it becomes weaker. But I mean, we are dealing with genuine deaths, of course. And we assume that these genuine deaths are caused by goodness knows what. It's too horrible to think about what they're caused by. There are too many series on Netflix that deal with exactly this issue. You can imagine for yourself. But I assume, it goes without saying that there's zero evidence for any actual conspiracy. There's zero evidence for there ever being not even one blood libel. There are several times people who are forced into confessing, Jewish people who are forced into saying, yes, I confess. In fact, in this Lincoln case, one Jewish man is forced into confessing. He says, yes, I was part of the plot. But we assume there's no other evidence. We assume that this is coerced, maybe even forced by torture, confession. My broader question, as I say, is how on earth do we get this level of hatred? How is this difference produced? Why is there envy between Christians and Jews? Why do Christian writers and Christian communities, on the one hand, impute this imagined envy? Oh my goodness, the Jewish population want what we have. They can't bear that we celebrate our Eucharist. They can't bear that we have our happy feasts, Easter, and they want to destroy it. Where does that fantasy of envy come from? On the one hand, on what basis is it? Is it really an economic relationship which is being revealed through it? Is it something psychological? And on the other hand, why is there an imagination, or why are the Christians themselves envious of the Jewish population? What do they really want to do? What is their aim? What is the aim of all of these blood libels? Is it to produce a pure Christian community which has no outsiders in it? Is it that sort of thing? Which I think we can all understand, unfortunately, from all kinds of contemporary events. There are all kinds of racial tensions in our societies which do result in certain groups saying, oh, they want, whatever, a racially pure community. Is that what's happening? Is it genuine religious emotion? Is it a desire to convert? Well, this piece of art, I thought we could just pause for a second and just at least appreciate what's happening. This is the first example that we can find, in England at least, of anti-Semitic stereotypes. of anti-Jewish portrayals. And I think you can see, so this is from an Exchequer document. What's interesting about this artwork is it's just a doodle at the top of a financial document. So it's a financial document from the Exchequer, which is the royal accounts, and then somebody, whoever made the document, or maybe someone else, has drawn this at the top. We can date this from, around about 1233. Do you see the salient characteristics? Can anyone, it's difficult to read it, but you see the salient characteristics. Can anyone make any comment on this piece of art? Maybe thinking about terms of envy or anything like that.
I see the devil who...
Yes.
I personally see the devil who tricked two opposite people.
Here? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Trickery. Devil, well, we have the horns, absolutely. I believe that these people are all Jewish too, these ones too, and this is a Jewish king, or is it Moses himself? No, I'm not sure. With three faces. Okay, I don't know what's going on entirely. I think you're right that there's trickery. The conflation that Jewish people have horns, this is an idea that enters into anti-Semitic art. I believe it comes from a mistranslation from the Bible. I think it's like rays of light shone out of Moses' head, and it was translated as horns, and then mistranslated as horns in some version, and then there was this idea Jewish people have horns. This one I find ludicrous because Jewish people are living in cities in England. So, where does this idea of horns come from? Is no one, again, we're back to envy, not being able to really see what's in front of you. So blinded by your own prejudice that you can't actually see there are no horns. Yeah, Mariam.
I'm also interested what's up with, balance scales.
Oh, yes.
What is happening there?
Well, this is a financial document, and I believe that there's some element of... I think these are coins, actually, in there, and I think there's some association. I should say that early on, there is an anti-Semitic association with money. Why does this happen? And this is important for understanding why there's persecution, maybe. If you want to take the economic track, if you think that the root of all envy is avarice, if you like, in medieval Europe, particularly in this period, usury, which is the loaning of money, is prohibited to Christians, right? Because the idea is that if I give you a loan and then you pay it to me back and I charge you extra, the idea is that I've sold time to you. That what have I done is I've exchanged time for money, and the idea is that this is wrong because God owns time, not you, not me. And so you're selling something that belongs to God. So this is one theory, but whatever the justification is, money lending is banned to Christians. They're not allowed to do it. It is against the religious code. So consequently, the jobs of banking and money lending are increasingly done by Jewish people because there's a gap in the market. Somebody still needs, we need capital. People needed money to, and they needed banking and they needed people who would have assets and would exchange and blah, blah, blah. So the short of it is that there's this association between Jews and finance which goes right back to this period of Jewish banking. Yes, Anne.
I have a question concerning the stereotype of horns.
Yes.
But don't Christians believe in Old Testaments and the Moses story as well? They just believe in New Testaments as well, as far as I know. Don't they believe in Old Testaments? Why do they laugh on it?
Yes, I know. Well, this is a good question. On the one hand, I think, it's not saying Moses is branded with the same, but there's a sense that the Old Testament has been superseded, that the wisdom of the Old Testament has been made better and has been revealed through the New Testament. I don't think it's wrong to say that there's a hierarchy of testaments and that the Old Testament is lesser than, incomplete. Someone like, maybe not Moses, but the Jewish people in the Old Testament are in hell for the Christians because they didn't know Christ. They were not saved through Christ. So that's something, as unfortunate and difficult and strange as it sounds, that's what's going on, I'm afraid. But it's not to say that they reject the Old Testament, that they see it as pagan knowledge or something like this. It's still an important part, but it has been perfected. If you think about Dante, for him, Old Testament figures are in limbo, in hell, many of them. And they were on the way to perfection, but they did not see the truth of Christ. They were unfortunate to be born too soon. Okay, I think there's one more question just here.
Why is it this triangle or maybe mounting?
This is just actually the shape of the document, I think. Although, yes, I'm not sure. It might have been the fold.
It really looks like a triangle.
It feels like an RMK.
Yes. Well, certainly with the king at the top. That would make sense of it. I can't exactly explain it. I can't. I wish I could. The horns, I would just take note, there is a sexual connotation with horns that is there. You may not see it yourself, in which case, good for you. But the horns, for example, goats are often symbols of lust, and the horns are seen as part of that. Again, I can't really explain all of this stuff. I mean, which is just as well, I suppose. Okay, what happens after all this? What's the culmination of all this persecution, blood libel, myth, violence, pogrom? In England, at least, in 1290, is that the Jewish population is finally expelled from England. That's the culmination of this. In the reign of Edward I, Edward Longshanks, in 1290, there's the Edict of Expulsion, and here is a rather disgusting image of that expulsion taking place, forcibly, as you can see. Historians kind of struggle with this. Why did Edward I expel the Jewish community? Is he responding to popular violence? Is it a crowd-pleasing move? Well, I want to be popular. I know what will make me popular. I'll expel a group of people. Is it that? Is it actually something else? Another argument is, quite simply, that it was financial good sense for Edward to expel the Jewish community because he owed loads of money to Jewish banks. And so if he expelled them, well, then he wouldn't have to pay his loans back. That's one of the theories. I think it's very difficult either way, because we are, after all, talking about the ripping apart of communities, the ripping apart of English communities. So it's a mystery that needs solving. I find it difficult and restrictive and reductive to say that it's because one man owed a lot of money. How would you get something through without popular support that involved ripping people out of communal life? But at the same time, I feel reluctant to say that this is a popular desire. It would be unprecedented that something that the people wanted was granted to them by a monarch just because they wanted it. So I go back and forth. I think at the very least you might argue that it's just the result of a structural tension that had not gone away, an envious problematic between two communities that resolves itself in this rather horrifying way. We'll put that in context in Europe in a second. But first of all, just in case, is it just the English who were terrible? And yes, they were terrible in this way, in producing racial difference. Well, let's take the tale of two other kings and just see how they dealt with the same problems. There were similar structural tensions emerging throughout Europe in the later 12th and 13th centuries. Bob Moore, who I think you're reading for seminar this week, has a book called The Formation of a Persecuting Society that wants to explain this spread of persecution precisely in the kinds of terms that we're thinking about. Like, there's something more than just, Jewish people have resources that Christians want, blah, 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 but something more at the sort of psychological level, that persecution is a way of achieving some fantasy in European life, that it's a persecuting society. The society only functions insofar as it persecutes. So this is all around Europe, but just to take two kings, there are other options. Frederick II is one of those other options. Fulda in 1236. This is the man I told you about briefly who kept falcons, who wrote the enormous falcon book, did all of his terrible experiments, and so on. often seen as quite an enlightened emperor. He's the German emperor. The year is 1236. In Fulda, there's a accusation made against the Jewish community, much like the Blood Libel accusations in England. And Frederick is asked to make a judgment. Did the Jewish people murder someone or not? Should they be expelled or not? And Frederick says, we pronounce the Jews of the aforesaid place and the rest of the Jews of Germany completely absolved of this imputed crime. So there are moments where we see there may be structural tension, there may be communal envy, but it doesn't always result in something catastrophic. Sometimes it can be healed or repaired. Sometimes there can be something like this, something that we might call a rational investigation, which produces a result. Sometimes we can have another approach. This is King Louis IX, Saint Louis, he then becomes, after whom is named St. Louis, the city in the United States and so on. St. Louis, King Louis, actually calls a disputation, the disputation of the Talmud. He has a trial in which the Talmud is condemned and then burnt. So the Jewish holy book. He has a disputation with scholars, is Judaism wrong on all of the facts? Are Jews really to be condemned rationally from a scholarly point of view, and results in burning the Talmud? So I don't know whether you think that's envy or not, or is that scholarly disputation, or is it envy in the disguise of scholarly disputation? But nevertheless, let's just put it in context of the Jewish community in Europe before we make our final judgment, is this envy or not? From 1150 to 1550. These are all the expulsions of Jewish people from territories, okay? Silesia in 1159, that would be the earliest now, the earliest expulsion. England in 1290 is the first of an entire nation. In 1182 to 98, from the Kingdom of France, just the Ile-de-France there, the royal territory there in France, Jewish people are expelled. From the entirety of the French hexagon, then in 1306. Germany, what we now call Germany, in 1348. Does that date ring a bell to anyone? Did something terrible happen in 1348? Something really, really terrible?
Something with witches, maybe?
Oh, no. Much more terrible than witches.
The Orthodox Christians and Catholic Christians?
It doesn't involve that, no. I'm looking for the name of a terrible pandemic which killed half of the population. Ah, yes, the Black Death. The Black Death. This 1348, 1349, 1350, 51 is the spread of a pandemic, the worst that Europe has had, I believe. Depends on which you count, or who's doing the number crunching. We're talking about something like 50% of the European population die from a disease, okay? 50%. It's a bacillus called Yersinia pestis on rats. I'm sure you know. It came from Omsk, I think. Actually, it came from somewhere not too far from here, actually. It originated in the steppe lands, probably a little bit south of here, maybe near the Caspian Sea. But it killed 50% of the European population. And in the aftermath of the Black Death, as it arrives in these territories, Jewish people often get the blame, which makes no objective sense because Jewish people are dying from the virus as well, the bacillus. But still, in the early stages of the virus, there's a sense that, well, if the Jewish community are responsible, we can have them. And you see it's the blood libel, I'm afraid, continuing, the idea that it must be a Jewish conspiracy, so many people are dying. I don't know, I've heard of this thing called QAnon, which I don't know if anyone, some horrible website. It's basically some similar kind of horrible conspiracy in the Middle Ages. People spreading lies to galvanize popular opinion against a group. Hungary in 1349, again following the Black Death. Austria, 1421. Provence, 1430. Spain, Portugal, 1492, 1497. Why do I show you all of these things? Oh, by the way, where did the Jewish community go? Oh, the Papal States, 1569, 1541. And God, it just continues and continues. Where do all these Jewish people go? Generally, they end up going to these yellow spots. These communities are pouring into certain spots. They are, from England in particular, going to the Netherlands, to Poland, from Germany and Silesia, from Austria and Hungary and other places down to Venice and down to the Maghreb and even into the Ottoman Empire. Why do I show you all of this? So you realize that it's a phenomenon that goes beyond specific structural conditions in one location. Because if you want to argue this is all economic, well, tell me the economic continuity between France in 1182, Silesia in 1159, and Naples in 1541, Portugal in 1497. I'm sure there are economic elements, but we need to look elsewhere to understand why there could be such a phenomena, so much hatred for one community that they can be forcibly ejected from their homes. So, of course, why is the question? Why do we get this? And let's look at 4 historians, shall we? We'll take 4 historians and look at their answers. And that might give us a cue of where we go next. So, here they are. Here are our 4 historians. Let's start with Mark Cohen, I think it is. Yeah. Under Crescent and Cross, 1994. This is the economic angle. As long as the Jews served a useful purpose in Christian society, they were tolerated. When their utility declined after the 13th century, especially from an economic standpoint, so did the stability of their lives under Latin rule. Okay, so that's your big economic thesis. So if you're going to look at this through the lens of envy, you can still do that. You can say, okay, well, there's envy of economic resources. But it seems that that's not what this argument's really doing. It's saying, actually, there's tolerance, 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 until a point where there's no necessity and then community expelled. There's no psychological aspect in this. Envy not really appearing that much. Okay, so let's look at another historian. Which one next? This is Bill Jordan. This was, by the way, one of my teachers at graduate school, and just the most wonderful teacher you can imagine. The French Monarchy and the Jews, 1989. To study Capetian policy toward the Jews is to explore at once the essence of French state building, and to some degree the essence of state building in the West. Okay, so, interesting. Now we're getting more psychological with Bill Jordan's point of view. It's about state building. So, what is it to articulate a state? Well, to say who's not in it. We can articulate something by saying who's in it? Well, who's not in it? So persecution can function to help build a state. This might be obvious to you thinking about other forms of state building in the past. Again, envy is there, but not really front and center. David Nirenberg, I believe he was one of Bill Jordan's students. Communities of Violence, 1998. Gets a little bit more theoretical. Stylized, ludic violence between Christians and Jews. Ludic means playful, remember. So, function to stabilize the relationship between majority and minority. It articulated boundaries in a controlled, restrained manner. This is interesting. It's hard to make the argument, based on what we've just seen, that a lot of this violence is ludic or playful. But what I would suggest is that he's showing us that we need to look beyond, as hard as it is, look beyond the really terrible moments of violence. Like if we were to talk today about, I don't know, some terrible racial violence that you might experience here in Russia, you know that that's not the whole story. Like you would say, but also, look, also, there are other stories of racial relations, aren't there? So when we get this big picture and we just see all the red spots on the map of England, it sort of seems like it's nothing but horrible violence. I think he's talking about the day-to-day life, that there was some degree of ludic violence and stylized, that it's playful too. But for the thesis that's going to lead us to our next section, I suppose we should ask Jeffrey Richards with his pipe. Sex, dissidence, and damnation. It looks suspiciously like a kind of sexual fear, the idea of defilement and also jealousy of sexual potency. So this leads us to the question of race relations and marginalization in Europe. Is there a sexual element? Is there something like sexual jealousy? Is there something like, I suppose, beholding an other group or community and feeling oneself to be incomplete in comparison? Which is to say, if we think about in Lacan's terms, or maybe through other paradigms, this other has some sexual enjoyment that I cannot have. This other has some fulfilled life of total whatever that is denied to me through my communal Christian life, whatever. Sexual envy. Let's explore it. And at first it might seem ridiculous. Like, we're talking about people being killed. We're talking about communities being uprooted. And we're talking about people being burnt at stakes in just about 3 seconds' time. How on earth could there be a sexual element? But the surprising thing when you look in the sources is there almost always is a sexual element in these outbursts of violence and marginalization. Take, for example, 2 groups, okay? Here are 2 groups who are both persecuted in almost identical ways. Well, not identical, but similar ways, about 100 years apart. On the one hand, we have the Cathars. This is a group of heretics, right? They have an alternative vision of what the church should be. Or at least that's what we think, because that's what we're told by the sources. But we have nothing that survives written by a Cathar. Nothing at all. All we have is what their accusers tell us that they got up to. And more often than not, the accusations are that Cathar life involved this sexual license, that it involved specifically sodomy, which is same-sex relations. This is the way of describing it in medieval texts, sodomy. And the theory is that Cathars do not believe in procreation, right? Which is apparently true, that these Cathars apparently believe that the human body was corrupted, that it was evil, it was created by Satan. It's only the soul that is perfect. So consequently, do not have children for Cathars, because if you have children, you're trapping another soul in a devilish body. What a horrible view, by the way. But still, this is apparently the Cathar theory. So then their accusers say, aha, yes, and so they don't have children. Instead, they're always committing acts of sodomy. That's how they get their pleasure, because they don't want to have children, because that would be trapping souls. So that's what they do. It's sodomy. So this is what one of the accusations that gets thrown at the Cathars. So what begins, apparently, as a difference of opinion, what is the nature of the body and the soul? What is the direction of salvation? Are there one God or 2 gods? Actually becomes fixated on the question of sexual morality pretty quickly in the sources. This case is more specific with the Templars. This is another group 100 years later. These guys, who founded the Templars? It's a good question. Who wrote the rule for the Templars? If you had to guess the name of one 12th century monk who comes up in every lecture, what's his name? Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux. So Bernard of Clairvaux actually wrote the rule for the Templars, right? So the Templars started out as really official. They were, and arguably they were always official. But what happens in around about the year 1308, and maybe it's because there's a lot of Templar gold and wealth, or maybe it's for other reasons, but the King of France ends up trying them as heretics. And they all get, the Templars are forced to either convert, or a few of them are burnt at the stake. This is seen in 1309. And noxious fumes being locked out there in this image. It's a horrible image. But the point is that the Templars, there's a trial, and the King of France and his investigators end up manufacturing all of these sort of justifications for why the Templars are evil, why they need to be burnt at the stake, why they should have all their money taken off them. And a lot of this is about, again, sexual immorality, and specifically sodomy. So all of these Templars are, in fact, here's where we get torture. Some of them are tortured and forced to confess, yes, it's true. We have this ritual where somebody stands up and we all kiss him, and then we bring in a chicken. And, it's all this sort of nonsense. But again, the idea is simple. Who are the Templars? They are our enemies. What do our enemies get up to? More sex than us. More sexual fun than us. Much worse stuff than we would allow ourselves to do. This is, once again, the theme. As a bit of fun to illustrate this, I thought, and to show you that it goes beyond kind of just these like intense moments of religious disagreement and theological disagreement. Let's look at magic for a second, because this is really interesting. And once again, we see the same structure, right? A group of outsiders are identified, they are accused, And the accusation involves this fantasy of sexual gratuitousness. So this is Vox in Rama, okay? This is the title of a papal bull from 1232. I believe it's Pope Gregory IX. And this is a condemnation of magical practices. So it's not witchcraft yet. Interesting you mentioned witches. But basically it's similar stuff. But the difference here is it's not women, like it's not a female-only group. This is imagined as a group of magical practitioners. This is what they do, those necromancers, those magical people. They meet up and this is what they get up to. And Pope Gregory describes it in detail, loving detail, okay? And I'm going to go through it and it's going to be a bit horrible. When a novice is to be initiated into the magical circle and is brought before the assembly of the wicked for the first time, a sort of frog appears to him, a toad, according to some. And then some bestow a foul kiss on his hind parts, others on his mouth, sucking the animal's tongue, and slaver. Sometimes the toad is of normal size, but at others it is as large as a goose or a duck. So much detail, so much detail. And it gets worse, and there's more and more and more of it. What's next? This horrifying image here. The novice comes forward and stands before a man of fearful pallor. His eyes are black, and his body so thin and emaciated that he seems to have no flesh and be only skin and bone. And then what does he do? Of course, the novice kisses him, and he is as cold as ice. After kissing him, every remnant of faith in the Catholic Church that lingers in the novice's heart leaves him. Okay, this strange connection between his sexual practices and losing his faith. Okay, what else in this horrible ritual? Remember, this is a pope writing this, and he's writing all this detail himself.
Is this dead body or?
I don't know what that. I don't know. He doesn't tell us. Then all sit down to a banquet, and when they rise after it's finished, a black cat emerges from a kind of statue which normally stands in the place where these meetings are held. It is as large as a fair-sized dog and enters backwards with its tail erect. And then what happens? Oh, God. First the novice kisses its hind parts, then the master of ceremonies does the same. And finally, all the others in turn, they all kiss each other. At least it's only kissing, I suppose, but still. But probably it gets worse. Yes, finally, when this ceremony is over, the lights are put out, and those present indulge in the most loathsome sensuality, having no regard to sex. If there are more men than women, men satisfy one another's depraved appetites. Women do the same for one another. Okay, so that's Vox in Rama. So the thing, and then I think, there's one final element, isn't there, which is, actually, unfortunately, there are two elements. Each year at Easter, when they receive the body of Christ from the priest, they keep it in their mouths and throw it in the dirt as an outrage against their Saviour. Again, desecration of the Eucharist wafer, just like Jews were accused of. And there they are. And then finally, the big man himself. These most unfortunate people believe in Lucifer and claim that he was the creator of the celestial bodies and will ultimately return to glory when the Lord has fallen from power. Through him and with him, they hope to achieve eternal happiness. What does it all mean, guys? Well, look, you can see at the very least that persecution and sexual envy or jealousy are often tied together in different forms, whether it be accusations of Jewish sexual violence. And by the way, there are many more accusations of Jewish sexual strangeness, if you like, but I just don't want to go into it. There's even male menstruation, which is imagined. It's the fantasy of the sort of fantasy sort of spins out of control. So this meeting of sexual envy and jealousy and persecution goes hand in hand. It's interesting that it results in extreme violence in many of these cases, in actually going to the point of killing the other. But you can see that it spreads across groups. Look at how strikingly similar the accusations against the Templars and the Cathars are with this magical group, also with the Jews too. Are you all still with me? Okay, this is the last bit. Seeing race in medieval Europe. And here it's just more our turn to reflect. Do you think that, this is a rhetorical question, I want you to think, do you think that what we're seeing here is a universal structure of, for example, racism. So we have racism in the 21st century. A student came to me today and said, and it's the classic question, but it was an interesting one, a student says he has this thing where he constantly sees history in circles and says, how do I get out of this pattern of always thinking it's the same thing over and over again? So, well, at some level, there are some structures that repeat themselves. Persecution comes around again and again. The question is, as historians, that we don't want to have a simple explanation like it's always the same thing, same structure. We're interested in the differences, because the differences are where it all happens. That's where we can understand this in its full richness. Like, I don't think if we just say all persecution is always the same, it explains the weirdness of what we just saw. It doesn't explain how that fits into a society. It doesn't explain how people were convinced by it. There's always some other element in the story. But that aside, is racism universal? Or is racism a modern way of thinking? Does it depend upon a post-Enlightenment classification of races? You remember, like, Darwin, for example. Does racism essentially depend on Darwinism, a sense that humans can be more or less evolved? Does it depend on the particular importance that race has played in 19th, 20th, 21st century politics through the modern movements of slavery, which was racialized and which was based on a racial science, pseudoscience? So that's a question for you to think about. And when we encounter things like Jewish persecution, is racism a useful word? Or does it reduce something that's happening in the Middle Ages? Like, what level of generalization are you happy with? If racism is a suitable term, we can stick with it. If it seems to not get at the specificity of what's going on, or if it seems to introduce a 21st century issue and clouds a 12th century problem, then we need another word too. As it happens, there's a very good book by someone called Geraldine Heng, which I was reading just this week, I think The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages, which does approach this question. And for her, it's not a problem. For her, racism is always the articulation and management of difference among peoples, and that we can explore it in different contexts in different ways. But that racism then becomes a useful terminology for understanding some of this stuff. I've seen the opposite argument made in different ways. Forcefully, I have seen the opposite argument made, that there was no racism in the Middle Ages, that to say that is to be pessimistic about human history. For what it's worth, this is definitely the articulation and management of a difference between two different groups of people. And it's definitely the creation of certain boundaries. And certainly persecution does seem to tally with modern racism. Let's have some other examples, and let's go beyond the Jewish example. Let's go to this familiar friend, the Hereford Mappa Mundi. I must have shown you all a picture of this more than once. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I showed you the Ebstorf map instead. This is my favourite map. This was made in around about the year 1300. It was made in Lincoln, actually, but then now it's in Hereford Cathedral. It's an enormous map. It's almost the height of this room. It's one single skin. Is it a goat skin or a sheep skin? I forget. Stretched so fine. It's enormous. It's a map of the world. It's an enormous round map with Jerusalem at the centre, right next to this mermaid here that you can't quite make out. Europe is down here. Here is England. Here is Ireland. I never mentioned that Ireland is the subject of enormous racism in these terms either, in a book called The History and Topography of Ireland by Gerald of Wales. But maybe I'll get to it in a minute. But here's Ireland here. Russia, incidentally, is represented by a bear on this map, which I find just wonderful. Some things never change. Africa is down here, the Red Sea. What's at the edge, the quote-unquote edge of this world? This is where it gets fairly interesting in terms of seeing or not seeing race. At the edges, this side of this map here, are a series of peoples, legendary peoples supposed to live in Africa, but beneath, in the desert of Africa. Who lives there? And again, I think it's fair to say that there's an element of sexual fascination here, But I think there's also a fair amount of something envious blocking your sight. So let's have a look. There's, for example, these blemmies here. These people who have their heads in their chests. Where are their heads? They don't have heads. They have eyes and nose and a mouth in their chest, of course. That's how they live, down there. The next, other groups, let's have a look. These are fantastical. I believe there's some longer in history heritage of a lot of these fantastical people. Some of them are medieval inventions. And you can find some of them Marco Polo. What is this guy doing? I believe, I'm not sure, I think this is a troglodyte, which is quite interesting. There are these people believed to eat snakes. They live in caves and they eat snakes and they can't speak. This is some form of, and I think actually I only have the two. If we zoom out again, maybe we can have a look. I didn't show you my favourite, which is the monopod. The monopod has 1 foot, but it's an enormous.
Deity is from the above, the second.
This guy? Yep. Oh, yes. But the guy I'm thinking of has an enormous foot that he uses to block out the sun. And because, of course, there's so much sun in the desert, wouldn't you need an enormous foot to block out the sun? There's also a guy with enormous ears who also flaps the ears to keep himself cool in that sub-Saharan heat. What's going on with all this? I don't know. Are they laughing at the other? I think so. What kind of laughter is that? Good question. But there's just this fantasy. The body of the other must be different, and it must be excessive in some way. Something like the Mappa Mundi, and you can explore this through Marco Polo. As I mentioned, you can also explore it through Gerald of Wales' History and Topography of Ireland. The fringe is not always far away. The History and Topography of Ireland, incidentally, this is written by a Welshman named Gerald of Wales, going from Wales to Ireland. That's how far. How far is that? It's like going to Hunty Mine Sisk. No, it's obviously much closer than that, right? We're talking, it's so close. It's 2 hours on the boat, on the fast boat. And yet, in Ireland, he encounters all kinds of mystical creatures, magical things, phenomena that you could not imagine. Nature does not work in the same way in this fantastical place where the other lives. And yet again, there are these sexual fantasies. Yet again, there's this idea that there are people who live somehow closer to the earth in a more barbarous way. He obviously produces a difference between himself, the civilized Welsh, Christian, and these Irish people who belong to a non-civilized Celtic other. It's a production of race. But in practicalities, as I'm sure you all know, racially, what is the difference between Wales and Ireland? Is it even meaningful to talk about a difference? They're from different language groups, Brythonic or Gaelic, but still, there's no real, it can show you just how slim the difference can be between one group and another group, that we still get a production of racial difference. And for Gerald, it's as hard as it could be. Like there are werewolves in Ireland because it's other, because they're racially different from him. I think just to round up, and we'll see him again for some reason. To round up, let's go to the question of dark skin. Black people in the Middle Ages, Moors in the Middle Ages, often a word used. Here we have a depiction of a Moor. If you remember, this is the word that Iago uses in Othello to describe Othello, the Moor. He only calls him the Moor. I hate the Moor, he says. Moor, we often associate Moor with Morocco, North Africa. But whichever way, you start to see more depictions of Moors with dark skin in around about the 11th, 12th century. On the left here, you have, and it's a good question, and there are a few projects to try and find dark skin in medieval images, because it's not always imputed. There's a theory that at some point in the 12th or 13th centuries, European nobility discover their own whiteness, that they start to articulate themselves as having a different colour skin. That's not always depicted. But here we have, for example, two demons. There's the story in the Synoptic Gospels that Christ, deals with people who've been possessed by demons. He banishes the demons. turns the demons into pigs, and the pigs commit suicide. Strange story. But here you see the people possessed by demons now made black in this image. Obviously, you see here the same kind of fantasies that we saw with depictions of Jews. Always the nose. I don't know why. I don't know why. Why must the nose always be the thing that is changed? I'm sure there's some explanation. You can see the sort of animalization of the teeth here. Red hair, it's quite interesting. Here's one, though, that's much more interesting, I think, to analyze. This is, and here's where Othello comes in. This is a depiction from the 13th century of, there are two panels missing that I cropped out, but they just set up the scene, of a Moor, a man with dark skin, a Moor being caught committing adultery or just simply sleeping with a woman. Here, the racial difference seems to be important. You know, she is coloured extremely, you know, she is white coloured, he is dark coloured. It's made into this extreme difference of race, which, remember, you know, actually this is a Spanish text. I mean, it's obviously accentuating and exaggerating something that is there. The racial difference is being highlighted. But what happens in this story, there's a public uproar, and the two of them, the Moor and the woman he slept with, are both burnt as punishment for this adultery. This is harsh by any standards. But she is saved by the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary saves her, the woman. She's saved because, of course, she's not a Moor. Is that the story here? Now, I don't know how we understand this. I think, on the other hand, I think it's simple that you see here, yet again, we see racialized tension being blended with sexual tension, sexual anxiety, sexual jealousy, just as we see in Othello, just as we see with all of those persecutions we just talked about. But I wonder if it's the blackness, I wonder if it's the darkness of skin, the epidermal difference that is dictating the terms here, that he is not saved because of his epidermis, his skin, or is it some religious difference which is not specified? Is it that he's Muslim and that a way of rendering Muslim in text is to conflate it with skin color? What is Muslim? Muslim is not like us, therefore we'll accentuate that through skin. I don't know. It's an interesting question. How important is the epidermis, the skin, the superficial element of the human form? How important is that in making this difference, in articulating it? Finally, however, just to point out, and I suppose the point is to end on a note that it is not the only story that we can tell. It's not that the only story we can tell about racial difference and racial negotiation is one of sexual envy and violence. We have to have some other element. We can't end on that. One element is that it's interesting, around about the same time as we get this envy and we get blackness being identified and accentuated, we also get the emergence of the fact that one of the three wise men, one of the three magi, is now depicted as black or having darker skin in so many different texts. So here we have Balthazar, the Magus. I think this is an early 13th century text, and his skin color is accentuated. It becomes more accentuated in different versions. I should say that this is in a backdrop where suddenly the torturers of John the Baptist are now being represented as African men. How does this happen? Even the torturers of Christ are sometimes being represented as black. So there is some production of skin color difference as being the key factor or a key factor. They're not, against historians who've sometimes argued that they're colorblind in the Middle Ages, that they don't see skin color or as racial. I believe that that's not true based on what I've seen. But here we have, for example, a Saracen being depicted, again with the dark skin, which is interesting in itself, that Islam now being more and more depicted as there being a more significant skin tone difference, which is not the case in earlier texts. In earlier texts, you cannot tell the difference. You'll instead have a religious symbol which determines this is the Muslim army, this is the Christian army. Not all of them, but in many of them. And here, I don't think this is a depiction which makes monstrous. I don't think it demonizes. I don't think it accentuates a sexual Envy, I don't know, you could make some dubious claim about this stick or sword or whatever. But the most interesting example, I think, and one to end on, is this statue here, statue of St. Maurice in Magdeburg. This is from the 13th century. It's the last image, the last slide today is this one. And it's interesting because it's in the 13th century that this statue is, and you can see it's made of wood, it's produced. This guy is a saint. He's from the early church. He's one of the early martyrs from like the 300s, I think, or 200s AD. Early Christian martyrs, a man named Maurice. He died heroically. He's seen as like this ideal knight. But here, in the 1260s, Maurice is being made black, without any real precedent, I understand. I don't know whether it's his name, Maurice, recalls more. I don't know. It is, at least, at the very least, a site of an alternative way of imagining. He is heroized. He is depicted with some stereotypical features, perhaps, but at the same time, it's not a demonizing rendering. He is, after all, being celebrated as a saint. Now, some have argued that's because, and you might think back to Frederick II, Germany in this time, what we now call Germany, is a much more tolerant place. It's a place where there is more openness to people of different races and communities. In the reign of Frederick II, an emperor, after all, who learned Arabic, or tried to learn Arabic, who negotiated a bloodless crusade, that was the same guy, that there is space for an alternative imagination of what the other might be, the other as saint. Now, I know that we can still code this within the racism spectrum. We can call it exoticization. We can call it fantasy of the other. But still, I think there's something more subtle going on in this kind of image, a more subtle living with, if you like. All right, guys, that's the unfortunate story of hate and persecution. Thanks for being so alert most of the time. Do you have any questions, or can I answer any questions, or can we have a wider discussion for any time? How long do we have? We have a theoretical 12 minutes if you want questions, or we can also all go home. Does anyone have anything to ask or say? Nikita?
Yeah, I'm interested in why you use word racism, race, in all this context, because I also know that there are some words like nationalism and special words for Jews like anti-Semitism, and I'm not really understand why it's all racism, and is it it?
Yeah, I mean, good question. As I've said, it is one way into the question. I'm not suggesting that it's the way into the question. That's not my opinion. I think it's one term that we could use critically to try and understand relations. I think envy is a good word. I think envy is a more interesting word for me. It's obviously our word of the day. I think understanding persecution and violence through the lens of envy reveals a lot psychologically, but also that it's about communal identity too, and communal fantasy. So so you don't have to use racism, and of course we can use other words. And using one word doesn't stop us from using other words alongside it. We can say this might fall under the umbrella of racism. It might also fall under the umbrella of anti-Semitism or prejudice or sexual jealousy. Any other questions?
Will it be something more connected with witches? Or?
Witches. The question is, where are the witches? Well, the witches are all in the 1400s, late 1400s. The Malleus Maleficarum, I think, is 1485. And that's the first book which mentions witches properly. So they're late. Can anyone answer that? I remember having some students who, Alina, Lisa, others, who did witchcraft with me last year. Do you remember any details? Well, what I would say is witches obviously fulfill a lot of the same criteria. The persecution of witches is also accompanied by a certain level of sexual anxiety and envy. But of course, it's slightly different, isn't it? Often there's an assumption that these are women who are not sexually active, or they're not having children or something like that. And there's the other anxiety. It's like But then I suppose, yes, we can definitely look at that through the prism of envy. I always like to resign responsibility for the witches because it's after 1400. Yeah. Okay, Vladislav.
So today in the lecture we considered the sexual argument for persecutions as kind of label of sexual envy, but maybe it is a label of sex, understanding of sex as something impure, and if you need to say that someone is wrong, you should show that this person is unpure for society, and maybe it's the reason why sexual context is often rise in these persecutions.
Yeah. So then the important discourse comes about what is pure and what is not, and defining what purity is, and then making others not that, or saying this is the boundary between us and them, is there's a certain purity here, not there. I suppose the book is Mary Douglas, isn't it? Purity and Danger would be the good place to go, and I think that'd be a really useful text to understand precisely this stuff. I think we need anthropologists to work with historians, and I think they often do, to understand this sort of thing. But yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it's a discourse about what is pure and what is not. But remember, those are claims that are being made. There's no absolute truth about what is pure and what is not. Marianne.
What is that fine line between envy and lust if we consider sexual aspect?
Yeah, the fine line between envy and lust. Well, it's not so much that the people who accuse, everyone who does these weird things with cats and frogs, and it's not like they want to do that themselves. Lust would be being drawn into the web of desire. I also want this object. But of course, as we learn, envy is not about wanting something. It's about not wanting it. It's about wanting someone not to have the thing. So I think what we're seeing with all of this is an anxiety that someone else is having, an excess of sexual enjoyment that you don't want them to have for unspecified reasons that we call envy, right? So it's not like lust. When they accuse the Cathars and the Templars, they're disgusted by the sexual acts, or at least they claim to be. Oh, it's sodomy, and that's wrong. So that's the difference, right? Whereas with lust would be much more that they're intrigued and attracted by the sexual acts. I think obviously we're seeing attraction and repulsion at the same time. But yeah, there's a distinction, I think, which I hope is clear. Okay.
Following your logic.
All right. Okay, microphone, please, yes.
Following your logic, don't you think that envy connected with hate?
Oh, absolutely. I think envy is a way to talk about hate.
But the hate is connected with sexual desire.
In what way?
In all ways, I guess.
I think, Elijah, do you want to comment on that point?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
A bit related to this.
Okay.
The more you hate something, the more you want it.
Well, I don't know if that's always true. I think that there are many different types of hate. I think hate is not a precise category. It's not as precise as envy in this sense. Envy we can reduce down to a relationship of wanting the destruction of something that someone else has, or wanting some kind of failure in another. Whereas with hate, we can see hate that arises through multiple sources of anger or irritation or hardening of the heart or whatever. So, Nikita, I think you had a question, and then Elijah will go to.
Yeah, I'm thinking of conquistadors' actions against Inca's empire, and basically they got something from it, like they got the silver, gold, and something. But still they destroyed all Inca cities and all like buildings. And is it envy or not? Because like it's not only about destruction of your enemy, but also about getting something for you, which is not about envy, like as I understood. But still they destroyed, and there was no purpose to destroy all this civilization, and it seems for me like kind of jealous or envy. And is it count as envy?
I think when we look at the motivations for a big event like that, we can't reduce it down to one thing or another. I think like what I was trying to say with persecution is that envy could be a way to explain some of this stuff. I don't think it explains all of it. I think as good historians, we think, well, there's also hard economic realities. There are hard social antagonisms. There are political factors. Envy can be another way into understanding something like this. It can be a way to add more psychological complexity to some of the conflicted moments. I think likewise, with something as complicated as that, you would have to, as a historian, ask yourself, how useful is envy as a category in analysing this? I think if we're saying, that why did an enormous moment happen with all of these different factors, envy would be too thin to explain all of it. Envy is a wonderful way to explain Iago betraying Othello, because it's two individual actors. There's some psychology there. Envy can be a factor in the way stories are told, the way myths are spread. The Blood Libel spreads through an envious, attractive magnetism. Like, did you hear this story? And I'm interested in it because it stimulates, perhaps, it's an envious paradigm that I might enjoy. I don't enjoy it, of course, but someone in the Middle Ages in that particular time may have enjoyed it. So, but when we're talking about a big political event, like enormous amounts of people go on ships across to another part of the world and commit kinds of acts, it could be a way into understanding how individual acts are taking place. But the whole thing, I think we probably need something larger and structural to... And of course, the other thing is we can never explain motives, because we don't know why we do things, do we? I mean, why, even if I ask you a simple question like, why did you choose this class? None of us really know the answer to our own motive question, so it's quite difficult to ascribe motives to others, but that sounds a bit defeatist. I like your question, but yeah, my short answer is the onus is on us as historians to say when is envy useful, when does it stop being useful? Elijah.
So I guess there are two questions I want to ask. First of all is that this thin line between envy and anger, it's still kind of elusive to me, because my theory is that envy shifts into anger when the action starts being taken. Like when you just look at somebody and you don't want this person to possess something. This is envy, but when you, take action, it's anger. Now, like, if you can explain maybe, like, what's the difference between them? Because when does the anger starts?
Yeah. So you remember that for some thinkers, envy leads to anger directly in a concatenation thesis, like the heart hardens and then anger, as you say. Well, the distinction is exactly as you say, that envy is a psychological problem or state, anger is an action or involves some kind of charging of yourself into a rage. It's the loss of control. So you can be envious and still maintain control. Iago is envious, maintains his control throughout Othello. He's not acting on impulse.
So envy is more rational, we can say.
We could say that. I think that by de facto definition, envy is rational, or at least takes place through rational means. Anger, by definition, is a passion. So, but I think that
psychologists have an opposite opinion that envy is less rationalist than anger.
Yeah, I can imagine exactly that we could flip it. It depends on different definitions. That anger is rational because it's a rational response to a situation. I'm angry, and there's a good reason for my anger. I'm stressed, and this was a stimulus that would make anyone angry. I'm envious, it's irrational. Why did I produce this fetish in my mind that I blame everything on? Well, so yeah, it depends on your definitions. But I think the thing with anger, right, is anger is obviously a passion which tends towards violence. So if we think about, it's really about the loss of control. So maybe if we say, it's not about whether it's rational or not, is it controlled or not?
Okay. And the second question is also about those connections between sins. I wonder how, or if it can even do that, pride lead to envy? Because we have this kind of a debate. Because, when you have pride in your heart, you don't care about other people anymore. You don't even look at them. But somehow, we know that pride is like the first sin that gives birth to other sins. So what's the connection there? Can we even trace this connection?
Well, different medieval thinkers have different answers. So the question is always think about, in relation to whom? There's no absolute answer to this, obviously. So how does John Cassian frame this? How does Gregory the Great frame this? How does Dante frame this? But I think the general answer among many of those names is that pride is when you start to consider yourself more important than others, right? And you don't need others. And the envy then is a pathologization of that. If you don't need others, then you start to have an estrangement with others. And envy is the manufacturing and the multiplication of that estrangement in a way. Like, I'm not like you, I'm better than you, but now, outrageously, you have something that I would like for myself, and now I wish you didn't have it because you don't deserve it. Like, so you can see how pride leads to that. It's like, and now I feel like I'm channeling Bernard of Clairvaux, who would say something along those lines. But it's when you start to believe in yourself as mattering more than the other, then it can lead to wanting the other not to have those things. Like, it's a sense of justice that you then. So yes, and this is why justice is quite a difficult category, because yes. So that would be my best explanation. But I think all of the different writers have different explanations for that link. Yes.
I just remember when you talked about the fact that pride starts with this sense of curiosity.
Yeah.
And maybe that's when you can, you have curiosity and like laughing a bit or having a certain approach, and maybe that's when, like the paths differ and you can go either very proud or envious, maybe.
No, I think that is exactly Bernard of Clairvaux you quote, so that's good. We should go back to him. I think you're right. Curiosity for him was the beginning. So it's a good theory and a good comment to end on. Thank you very much, guys, and excellent. Really enjoyed it. I look forward to our seminar on Thursday, where we're reading the text I mentioned earlier. And then next week, of course, is Sloth, Acadia, so we can all have a relax. Okay.